They tell us about Greece as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art. But behind the marble temples and heroic poems was a truth too dark to celebrate. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival was not a blessing, it was a sentence worse than death. They watched their husbands fall, only to be bound, sold, and stripped of name, language, and dignity. Every bond of family was torn apart, every trace of identity erased. These women were not forgotten by accident. They were silenced by design. To remember them is to uncover the shadow that built civilization itself. The battle had ended, and the defenders lay scattered on the ground. The clash of shields and the cries of men faded into silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Women stood on the walls, helpless, their eyes fixed on the men who had fallen. They had watched husbands, brothers, and sons meet their end beneath the weapons of the enemy. The earth below was stained dark with blood, and the smoke of burning homes carried into the sky. For those left alive, grief pressed down heavier than the stones of the broken gates. Yet for the men, death had come swiftly, cutting short both pain and fear. For the women, the waiting had just begun. They thought this was the worst moment to see the people they loved struck down. They thought nothing could compare to this loss. But death on the battlefield was mercy. The real story began only after the city gates fell. The walls that once promised safety now trapped the women inside their ruined city. As the gates broke open, soldiers poured in, not with pity but with cold purpose. The cries of mourning were drowned out by commands shouted in a foreign tongue. Women were pulled from the places where they had sought shelter, driven into groups under the eyes of their captors. No longer seen as wives or daughters, they became trophies of victory, marked as spoils of war. Grief was forced aside by fear as rough hands bound them together, stripping away the last traces of dignity. What had been a home only hours before turned into a marketplace of human lives. For the conquerors, this was not chaos but routine. For the women, it was the beginning of a life they could not yet imagine. The sorting began before the fires of the siege had even burned out. Once the women were gathered, the process of turning them into property began. Greek commanders and their scribes moved among the captives like merchants at a fair, noting details with practiced eyes. Age was marked first, separating children, maidens, and older women. Beauty was measured next, judged against standards that had nothing to do with the women's own worth. Even their clothing and signs of wealth were recorded to estimate potential value. Royal women or those from noble families were treated differently, not with respect but with the knowledge that their bloodlines could fetch higher prices. Every mark on the tablets reduced a human life to a column of numbers and traits. What the women saw as humiliation, the commanders treated as administration. This cataloging was systematic, stripping individuality and replacing it with categories. To the Greeks, this was efficiency. To the captives, it was the loss of identity. Yet these lists weren't just for record, they were blueprints for profit. When the records were complete, the women were sent toward the markets that turned human lives into trade. In port cities, stone platforms and wooden pens stood ready for this purpose. Buyers gathered to inspect the captives as if they were livestock, looking at teeth, skin, and strength. Young women considered beautiful were displayed more prominently, their value raised by competition among wealthy bidders. Older women were priced lower, sold for labor in households or workshops. Every gesture and every whisper in these markets reduced human beings to merchandise, their bodies appraised with the same cold eye given to animals or tools. The infrastructure supported mass movement, with ports designed to receive groups of captives and streets organized to funnel them into auction spaces. For the conquerors, this was commerce. For the women, it was the moment they ceased being seen as human at all. But the market price was only the surface of a much deeper cruelty. The cruelty of captivity reached beyond chains and markets. Families were torn apart with deliberate precision. Mothers were dragged from their children, knowing they might never see them again. Sisters who had survived the siege together were sent to different households, their bond treated as an inconvenience to be broken. Even the youngest were not spared, Children were scattered to erase the memory of belonging. Once inside Greek households, the attack on identity deepened. Women were forced to take new names in the Greek tongue, their old names banned as if their past lives had never existed. Speaking their native language was punished, their songs and prayers silenced. Traditions that once tied them to their homes were replaced with foreign rituals. What remained was an empty shell expected to serve without resistance. The strategy was not just to control bodies but to erase memory itself. Breaking bonds of family was only step one. Next came breaking the soul. For the captives, even faith offered no shield. Women who once found strength in their gods were forced to bow before the temples of their conquerors. They were made to take part in ceremonies that honored the very deities their husbands had died resisting. Sacred vows were mocked as captives were paraded through shrines, their presence turned into symbols of conquest. The story of Cassandra revealed how deep this violation could reach. A priestess sworn to Apollo, she was dragged from the altar itself and forced into the hands of those who claimed divine favor. Her fall showed that no bond between mortal and divine was safe once war had ended. What had been holy became a stage for humiliation, stripping women not only of dignity but of spiritual comfort. Faith, which should have been untouchable, became another weapon of control. And when gods themselves became instruments of mockery, no refuge remained. Life inside the household offered no relief from the torment of capture. Women lived under the constant shadow of fear, knowing every action could bring punishment. A wrong word, a failed task, or even a glance taken the wrong way might lead to beatings or starvation. Captives were not only subject to their master's will but were set against each other in silent competition. Some hoped that obedience or beauty might win them lighter burdens, while others suffered for falling short of impossible standards. Bonds that could have offered comfort were twisted into rivalries, as women were forced to fight for scraps of favor. Trust became dangerous, and kindness could be turned against them. Survival meant adapting to a system designed to strip away dignity and humanity at every turn. To live was to endure a game where the rules were cruel and always shifting. But even the household was just another stage of exploitation, with its own rules of control. The cruelty did not stop with the first generation of captives. Women who had been enslaved long enough were often forced to take part in handling new arrivals. They were made to explain commands, translate orders, and demonstrate the rules of obedience. What they had once suffered, they now had to enforce on others. This did not free them from pain. It only deepened the wounds by turning victims into unwilling tools of the same system that destroyed them. In some households, older captives trained younger ones in tasks, teaching survival in a world where disobedience meant certain punishment. The trauma became a cycle, passed on not by choice but by necessity. Each new wave of captives entered a structure already shaped by the broken spirits of those before them. In this way, cruelty became self-sustaining, requiring little effort from masters to keep it alive. The system fed on itself, creating generations of victims and enforcers. For women in bondage, even the birth of a child brought no joy or safety. Infants born to captives were the property of the master, their lives determined not by love but by profit. Some children were allowed to live if they were thought useful for labor or sale, while others, especially those of mixed parentage, were discarded as unwanted burdens. Infanticide was not rare. It was a calculated choice to protect household order or to avoid complications. Those who survived grew up without family ties, raised in the same system that had broken their mothers. For the women, motherhood became another form of suffering, as they were powerless to shield their children from harm. The bond that should have been sacred was turned into another weapon of control. Birth, which should have meant hope, became yet another stage of exploitation. And yet the story didn't end at the household door. It spread across seas. The movement of captives did not end in the markets of a single city. Women were carried across the Mediterranean on ships designed to hold human cargo. These vessels were fitted with extra storage for water and food, making it possible to transport large groups with minimal loss. Ports like Athens and Corinth became central hubs, where captives were unloaded, sorted again, and redirected to distant buyers. Roads and sea routes that once carried grain, pottery, and metals also carried the broken lives of women and children. Each stop along the way turned misery into profit, feeding local economies that thrived on the steady supply of enslaved labor. The scale of this system gave it a sense of routine, as if trafficking human beings was no different from trading goods. Captivity was not an accident of war but an organized industry. But behind the trade lay something even more dangerous: cultural acceptance. The system of captivity was not only enforced by soldiers and markets, it was also supported by culture itself. Greek literature praised warriors not just for victories in battle, but for the women they seized as signs of strength. Epic tales described heroes returning with chains of captives, their suffering transformed into proof of masculine glory. In painted vases and carved reliefs, scenes of conquest often included images of defeated women, shown as symbols of power and dominance. Even philosophy and education played their part, teaching that enslaved people, especially women from conquered lands, were naturally inferior and existed to serve. These ideas seeped into daily life, shaping how society viewed human worth. By celebrating the capture of women as an honorable achievement, Greek culture turned brutality into tradition. The stories children learned and the art they admired ensured the next generation would see cruelty as normal. This cultural indoctrination ensured the cruelty would not only survive, it would expand. The practices born in Greek warfare did not end with their city-states. Rome adopted and expanded the same systems, spreading captivity and exploitation across the Mediterranean on a scale even greater than before. What began as policies to control defeated women became a model for empires that followed, shaping laws, economies, and households for centuries. Records carved into stone and written on papyrus preserved details of transactions, while graves and skeletal remains revealed evidence of violence and neglect. Even in modern studies, traces of mixed ancestry confirm how conquest left its mark on populations. The legacy of this system shows that the celebrated ideals of philosophy, democracy, and art were built alongside a darker reality of systematic cruelty. For women, survival after war often meant a life more painful than death itself. History remembers the marble temples, but beneath their foundations lay the suffering of countless forgotten captives. The spear that killed a husband ended a life, but what followed destroyed generations.